Good afternoon. The first item of business is a statement by John Swinney on update on progress towards reopening schools. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of his statement, so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on John Swinney. Cabinet Secretary, please.
Presiding Officer, on the 23rd of June, I confirmed to Parliament that the collective efforts of the people of Scotland to suppress coronavirus had enabled us to bring forward our plans to reopen schools with the aim that they should be open to all pupils on a full-time basis from August. Since then, we have continued to see improvements in the data, have benefited from further detailed scientific advice, and have witnessed a relaxation of some of the wider restrictions placed on non-essential aspects of everyday life. In Scotland, the infection rate in the general population is currently reducing by 30% each week, meaning we now only have around 700 infectious people in Scotland, compared to 1,300 4 weeks ago and 5,000 at the end of May. While our country has had to wrestle with the loss of so many of our citizens to COVID, there have been no deaths among those under 16 years of age, and by the 12th of July, only 42 of the 5,939 hospitalisations were of people aged under 15. This represents less than 0.01% of the population in that age group and demonstrates an important message about the relative risk for school-aged children. Today I will update Parliament on progress towards fully opening schools in August and set out how we will address the wider impacts of the virus on the health and well-being, educational progress and attainment of our children and young people. We are now about halfway through the school summer holidays. I want to express my appreciation to parents and carers for their support to young people, to the teaching and wider workforce across Scotland for their efforts to sustain education, and to children and young people for their resilience during this difficult period. Throughout this crisis, the Scottish Government has been open when speaking with members of the public and in providing updates to Parliament. I have taken many opportunities to seek views from parents, teachers and young people on how the COVID situation and our journey out of lockdown is impacting on their lives. What we know for certain is that children and young people from across all age groups will have experienced some negative effects from being unable to attend school and from living in a world restricted by physical distancing. We know academic learning, peer relationships, safety, well-being and mental health are all at risk. Presiding Officer, it is both a moral and educational imperative that we lift these restrictions on our children and young people as soon as we know it is safe to do so. Last Thursday, our COVID-19 Advisory Subgroup on Education and Children's Issues published their latest scientific advice. The advisory group set out how we needed to consider the protection of the public from COVID, alongside the need to address the other harms caused by absence from school for children and young people. Their advice was clear that there was an overwhelming justification for the reopening of schools with appropriate mitigating approaches in place. That would, on balance, be significantly better for the well-being of children and young people. The advisory group specifically examined information on both physical distancing and safe school transport. This advice, which draws on multidisciplinary evidence from within Scotland as well as internationally, makes clear that subject to complementary risk mitigation measures being implemented, there is no requirement for physical distancing between children in primary schools. Although the advisory group recommended that on balance, no physical distancing is needed among secondary school pupils, they also noted that the position was less clear in that respect. After considering carefully that advice and the views of stakeholders, the Education Recovery Group is developing guidance that involves taking extra precautions and envisages that secondary schools will be asked to take a practical approach to maintaining distancing between pupils where possible. This could be accomplished, for example, by managing the flow of pupils and staff within schools and adjusting the layout of classrooms subject always to this not reducing capacity within the school. This approach, which is similar to that set out in the guidance developed by the Welsh Government and the Department for Education, means that pupils should be able to return to both primary and secondary schools full-time with appropriate mitigations in place. The advice recommends that staff should observe 2 metres physical distancing from pupils wherever possible, and it is important this point is reflected in advice. Regarding transport, it is the view of the scientific advisors that dedicated school transport should be regarded as an extension of the school estate, and therefore physical distancing between pupils is not necessary. The guidance will be developed to reflect that view and will set out a proportionate approach to ensuring the safety and well-being of children, young people and transport staff. I want to make it clear that the advice remains conditional on continued low rates of infection, effective surveillance measures and a process for handling any local outbreaks. Presiding Officer, we are working with our partners in the Education Recovery Group to produce guidance by the 30th of July that would enable schools to reopen in August. A final decision regarding whether we are in a position to reopen schools full-time and for all pupils will be taken by Cabinet on the 29th of July and set out to Parliament next Thursday. We will then bring forward an educational continuity direction to implement the provisions that are agreed. Importantly, this guidance is being developed in partnership with local government, unions representing teachers and other school staff, parents' representatives and public health representatives. This represents a shared commitment to provide parents, pupils, teachers and other staff with the reassurance that they need. Clear communication with all staff, parents, providers and trade unions on the reopening of schools will be important as we develop and implement this guidance to ensure that all those concerned understand the changes that are required and are confident in the revised arrangements. Local authorities or schools will be in touch with parents regarding the specific arrangements for the return of children and young people to school. We know that across different local authorities and within each local authority, there will be a range of unique challenges to address. There will be a need for some degree of flexibility in finalising the detailed arrangements for the new term. Some schools and local authorities may phase children back into school where necessary to provide assurance on safety. These issues will need to be addressed by individual schools through risk assessments to identify the appropriate actions and put them in place. The guidance will sit alongside similar information for early learning and childcare, other childcare services and youth work and community learning and development activity. This suite of national guidance is designed to help all our partners operate within the clear public health measures. This guidance will set out the comprehensive package of protocols necessary to reduce the risk of transmission of the virus, as well as advice on practical arrangements. Important school mitigations will include good hand hygiene practices, ventilation and improved cleaning regimes. These school mitigations are about working together to protect and to support each other. A number of specific public health measures will also be in place in schools. These include test and protect, outbreak management, and quick access to testing for all symptomatic staff and pupils. We shall also be monitoring very closely cases of the virus in schools, drawing on our tried and tested community surveillance and on existing healthcare surveillance measures. We are, in addition, currently developing proposals for a targeted enhanced surveillance programme, which will allow us to cast more light on any impact on pupils and staff in schools throughout the country. These measures will provide reassurance and allow adjustments to be made either to ease further or tighten up in the light of clear evidence of developments on the ground. As we progress, we know that we must continue to be ambitious, led by the evidence, and work in partnership with others. There will almost certainly be additional costs involved, and the £100 million additional investment I announced in June demonstrates our commitment to this agenda. As part of this new funding, we are ring-fencing £50 million specifically for the recruitment of additional teachers and support staff for the academic year 2020-21. This will enable schools to intensify support for children and young people as they return to face-to-face education and help to mitigate any learning loss. While I would stress that final numbers will be dependent on the precise mix of staff recruited and the needs of children and young people, I expect this will provide sufficient funding for approximately 850 extra teachers and give local authorities the flexibility to bring in around 200 support staff in schools across Scotland, subject to final agreement with our COSLA partners. All of the school workforce have a crucial role to play in our education recovery mission, and it is vital that they are supported to do so. I do not underestimate the logistical challenge in reopening our schools safely, whether that be, for example, to provide enhanced cleaning services or to address continuing capacity constraints on school transport. For that reason, I can confirm today that I intend to allocate a further £20 million of funding to local authorities to help address these additional requirements. This allocation recognises the extremely valuable work of our school cleaners, facility management and school transport staff, who are essential to the successful delivery of education in Scotland and to whom I pay tribute today. While this funding should provide local authorities with the assurance they require to progress plans immediately, we will continue to work with COSLA to understand the additional costs associated with the school reopening guidance that each local authority is facing and how these can be addressed alongside any loss of learning. COSLA have advised us that they will share the outcomes of the cost collection exercise associated with the school reopening guidance authority by authority as soon as they have completed this. We will take a responsible approach to supporting local authorities moving forward, and the level of funding will require regular, rigorous and transparent monitoring of costs. Presiding Officer, let me be clear that this is on top of the additional support that we have already made available. That includes providing local authorities or schools with enhanced flexibility in the £182 million of Attainment Scotland funding and the ability to redirect up to £508 million as a result of suspending provision of 1,140 hours of early learning and childcare. We have provided a £350 million package of community and wellbeing funding to support those in need. In addition, we have provided local authorities with a further £27.6 million to continue the provision of free school meals and wider food support to families through the summer holidays. We are investing £30 million as part of a huge digital boost through provision of laptops for disadvantaged children and young people. This includes £25 million of funding to enable a rollout of digital devices to school pupils to enable them to study online. When considered alongside the range of other measures, the Scottish Government will have made available or provided flexibility of over £1 billion across local authorities to tackle the impact of coronavirus and ensure that children get the support that they need. I also mentioned in my statement on the 23rd of June that we will be seeking the assistance of the youth work sector in supporting those families and communities who need it most. The sector has continued to support and engage the children and young people throughout the pandemic, including using digital technology and outreach work to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on children and young people's mental health, learning and development. I would now like to take the opportunity today to reinforce that commitment by announcing that we'll make a further £3 million investment in youth work to support education recovery. As well as important updates on the practical and logistical preparations for school reopening, I want to restate our vision and ambition for education in Scotland. Our collective aim is to achieve excellence and equity for all children. Our education recovery mission must be to further improve Scottish education and to accelerate progress in closing the poverty-related attainment gap. At the outset of this planning, our partners in the Education Recovery Group agreed 5 guiding principles to ensure that the child is always placed at the centre of our considerations. We agreed our approach must be safe, fair, ethical, clear and realistic. The guidance on health mitigations that we are now developing, based on scientific advice, will be designed to demonstrate for parents, carers, staff and pupils that it is safe for schools to reopen subject to continued suppression of the virus. A final decision on school reopening will be announced on the 30th of July. The plans for blended learning remain an essential contingency which could be applied at local, regional or national level in future if needed. I am grateful to local authorities for the work they have continued to do to refine their local plans for blended learning with appropriate challenge from Her Majesty's Inspectors of Education. In parallel, Education Scotland is expanding its close working with eSchool to ensure the availability of online lessons that will help support and augment the work of classroom teachers when schools reopen. eSchool will train additional teachers to provide online lessons across a range of subjects, which learners in the senior phase all across Scotland can access via Glow. Partners are now working together so that they are designed in English and Gaelic medium to complement what is being delivered in local schools. In closing, Presiding Officer, this statement has inevitably focused on the many practical and logistical issues around the reopening of schools. It is vital, however, that this work is set within the context of the moral and educational imperative of delivering education to every one of our children and young people. They have suffered during lockdown, and the Government and our partners are focused on putting in place the opportunity to access school to support their well-being and develop their potential. That drive must lie at the heart of all that we do.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on issues raised in his statement. We've got around 30 minutes for questions, after which we must move on to the next item of business. Could I ask members who wish to ask a question to press the R button in the chat function now? And I call first of all Jamie Green, to be followed by Ian Gray.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of his statement today. Given the progress we've made in tackling COVID-19, the question many people still have is what exact scientific trigger is the government actually waiting for to give the green light to fully reopen schools? We could do that today and end the uncertainty. Pubs, restaurants, churches and even the tourism sector have all now reopened, and we know that children are at least risk of anyone in the country from COVID-19. Surely the balance of evidence is already overwhelmingly in favour of schools reopening next month. I can see this, the public can see this, but today we still have a refusal to commit to schools reopening in just 3 short weeks. So let me ask the Cabinet Secretary 3 specific questions. First, today you mentioned again the phrase a phased return. Can you tell us how many of our 32 local authorities have indicated that they will be reopening schools fully to all pupils in the week commencing the 11th of August? Because if the answer is anything less than all of them, parents have a right to know when their children are going back to school. Second, if there are localised clusters of COVID outbreaks, can you confirm that these will be dealt with on a school-by-school basis rather than addressed to a blanket closure of all schools right across the country? And finally, on the issue of funding, given that one council alone has stated that the cost of reopening schools safely will require £20 million, does the Cabinet Secretary believe that the additional £20 million announced today for all local authorities will scratch the surface of what they actually need to reopen safely?
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, there are 4 main points in the questions that Mr Green has raised with me. First of all, the Government has made clear that schools, the planning assumption is to reopen schools full-time in August to all pupils, and that is what we and our partners are working to achieve. But we can only do that when it is safe to do so, and we have to see continued suppression of coronavirus within our community. And that is why it is important that we make the judgment at the correct moment when we can see some of the effect of the relaxation of lockdown that has taken place. Mr Green mentioned some of the relaxations that have taken place. We must monitor the data to determine whether or not there is any increase in the prevalence of coronavirus as a consequence of some of the measures to relax lockdown, and we must guard against any of that taking its course. Secondly, on the question, so that is why the decision will be taken next week and will be communicated to Parliament next Thursday. On the question of the return to schooling, all local authorities will be opening their schools as we indicated they would be on the 11th of August. That is the start date for the school term. Schools must make individual judgments about the circumstances they face and the circumstances that may face individual pupils as to whether it is safe for those pupils to return. I think, for example, of young people with additional support needs, where we need to take great care to make sure that the transition arrangements are properly and effectively put in place to meet the needs of those pupils. So ensuring that there is local flexibility in that respect within a national framework to resume education, as we have promised it would be on the 11th of August, will be a priority for the government. In relation to localised clusters of the emergence of coronavirus, I think the question from Mr Green enables me to make the point that I suspect that it will be fairly likely that we will see outbreaks of coronavirus within the school estate once schools reopen. We are seeing localised outbreaks, and we're dealing as a government just now with one in Lanarkshire. So we will want to take the type of targeted action that is currently being taken in Lanarkshire to deal with that particular circumstance should it arise in an individual school, because we want to avoid the situation of having more extensive lockdowns than are in fact ever necessary. And finally, on the issue of funding, I acknowledge that there are funding issues associated with the reopening of schools. That is why I have made an announcement today which will see £70 million invested directly in the delivery of education in Scotland today as a consequence of my statement. But that is also within the context of two other factors. One is that the government has allocated or given flexibility to local authorities around £1 billion worth of public expenditure to support their activities. And two, the government is actively engaged in dialogue with local authorities to assess the proceeds of their cost collection exercise on reopening of schools, which has not been supplied to the government yet in full, and which the government will consider in due course. So there is a context that is important to consider, the significant amount of money that the government has announced today to support local authority activity.
Ian Gray to be followed by Ross Greer.
Thank you, and thanks to the Cabinet Secretary for early sight of his statement. Schools are due to open in just over 2 weeks, yet we still have no final decision. Councils still don't actually have the additional resources they need, and guidance on risk mitigation is still being written. Government has never had a route map for the return of schools, and they still don't. They still look as if they're making this up at the last minute. The additional teachers referred to today amount to less than half a staff member per school, and councils have 2 weeks left to try and recruit them. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of newly qualified teachers, probationer teachers, supply teachers and retired teachers who all want to help get their schools back still cannot get a job. Surely we need to use every available qualified teacher we can. So the question is, how ready are we really? How many additional teachers have actually been recruited? What proportion of school buildings have actually been risk assessed for their pupils' returns? And as for mitigation, we are all of us over 5, wearing face coverings in shops. Can it really be the case that nobody is to wear a face covering in schools?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, we take forward dialogue with local authorities on the recruitment of teachers. That dialogue is underway, and we are setting out to local authorities the financial support that is available to them to recruit teachers, and I am very keen to ensure that newly qualified teachers are able to be utilised within the education recovery work that is taken forward. The local authorities and schools around the country have done an extensive volume of risk assessment and planning for the resumption of schooling within Scotland. That work has been ongoing for some considerable time as a consequence of the lockdown, to enable us to be in a position to take forward the reopening of schools. And on the question of face coverings, my view is really quite simple on this question, that if there is anybody who feels that they would wish to wear face coverings within a school environment, they should be able to do so. But the scientific evidence does not indicate to us that we should be obliged to enforce that position within schools. So I think we should, the issue should be left to the judgment of individuals to establish what are their considerations and their priorities in that respect, and they should be supported in the judgment to which they come.
Thank you. I have 13 questioners and 20 minutes. So the usual mantra, short questions, please, and reciprocal answers, and everybody will get their shot. Ross Greer, followed by Beatrice Wishart, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful for today's update. The Deputy First Minister has confirmed that it won't be the routine testing that Greens called for, which will be offered to staff and pupils in schools. Could he explain why it won't be routine testing? And there was also nothing new today about vulnerable young people. Last week's advice was that the burden to request protection should essentially be on them. Compare that to health boards who have been told to conduct risk assessments for Black and minority staff, for example. So will schools be required to conduct equivalent risk assessments for vulnerable young people and staff?
Cabinet Secretary.
In relation to Mr Greer's final point, the answer is yes. Risk assessments will have to be carried out in individual schools and to support the resumption of schooling for young people and for the work of individual staff. In relation to the question on surveillance testing that Mr Greer has raised, I'm very sympathetic on this point and have taken extensive advice from Public Health Scotland on the appropriate approach to surveillance testing. Now, we are going to have in place, and I think this is obvious from the measures that are available in the community in general, a very active test and protect arrangement, which we've seen working effectively in Lanarkshire in recent days. But that will also be supplemented by additional surveillance testing within schools. Now, I will be in a position to set out more details on that next week, but at the request of the Education Recovery Group, Public Health Scotland have been exploring what more can be done to provide the type of reassurance that Mr Greer seeks. So the details of the approach may not be identical to the proposals that Mr Greer brought forward himself, but I do assure him of the interest and the determination of the government to make sure that we have effective surveillance testing in place that can address the legitimate issues that Mr Greer has raised.
Beatrice Wishart, followed by Gail Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's right to prioritise health and well-being of pupils when schools return. I mean, young people may have experienced very real trauma during lockdown, but teachers reported that they were ill-equipped to deal with pupils' mental health concerns before COVID. They were feeling the effects of the loss of thousands of support staff. So how many of the extra 350 school counsellors that were to be in place by September 2020 will be in post in time for schools reopening?
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, we expect the overwhelming majority of those counsellors to be in place by September 2020. Because of the disruption of COVID to the recruitment process, there may be some of those personnel are not recruited until and able to start until October, but we expect the overwhelming majority to be available in September.
Thank you, Gail Ross, followed by Jamie Halcrow-Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Good afternoon, Deputy First Minister. In the recent report from the Advisory Subgroup on Education, it was stated that activities that cross classes and age groups, such as assemblies, choirs, gym, etc., should be introduced incrementally. Can you tell us yet what that might look like? And will any other practical subjects be affected, bearing in mind the positive effect that most of these have on mental health?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, activities such as whole school assemblies and choir activities, I am afraid, are activities that we are going to have to proceed with very cautiously, for obvious reasons that they are large gatherings of individuals, and also the act of singing can contribute particularly to the spread of coronavirus, as we have had to make clear in relation to the arrangements for the reopening of places of worship. Now, obviously, we are proceeding with caution because we want to create a safe school environment for children, young people and staff. And we want to make sure that we minimise risk to everyone involved. So there may well be constraints on some of the traditional activities that have taken place, but it is important, and I have stressed this in the guidance that was that's been issued to schools about priorities for the school term, that we take time, and particularly in relation to the issues that Gail Ross has raised, and also the points that Beatrice Wishart has just raised with me, to address the experience of young people during the lockdown period, and to make sure that we properly and fully and effectively support the well-being of children and young people at what's been a very difficult time.
Jamie Harker-Johnson, followed by Stuart McMillan, please.
Thank you. As the Education Secretary says, plans for blended learning remain an essential contingency, but the Scottish Government's failure to address severe gaps in digital poverty since schools were forced to close has been all too apparent. So can the Cabinet Secretary confirm how many of the 25,000 laptops he mentioned in his statement have actually been issued to local authorities or to pupils? And can he confirm whether or not the Scottish Government still expects, as it did at the start of the month, that these 25,000 devices will be in the hands of those young people who need them by the 11th of August?
Cabinet Secretary.
We obviously are in the school holidays, so we are working with local authorities to make sure that the 25,000 devices that we have ordered are in the hands of pupils for the start of the school term.
Stuart McMillan, followed by Daniel Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the £20 million allocated to support schools with other costs that they will face as they introduce the new health protection and cleaning regimes. Can I ask the Deputy First Minister if this will be a decision for local authorities to determine how these funds are best invested to meet local need?
Cabinet Secretary.
Those resources will be allocated to individual local authorities, and it will be up to those local authorities to decide how to utilise those resources to support their priorities.
Daniel Johnson, followed by Gillian Martin.
I'd like to ask the opinion of the statement. A portion of the existing teaching workforce will be unable to return for the new school year because of shielding and other coronavirus considerations. What is the assumed additional resource estimated to be required to implement the new guidance over and above the pre-existing workforce levels? And therefore, how much of the implied uplift in the funding announced today will this cover?
Did you manage to get all of that, Cabinet Secretary?
I think I caught most of it, Presiding Officer. In relation to shielding, as Mr Johnson may have heard from the First Minister's statement today, it is our expectation that shielding will be paused at the end of this month. So the issues around shielding are less likely to arise at the start of the school term. Clearly, local authorities and school by school will have to make individual judgments about the staffing resources that they have available to them. But what the government has set out today is provision to provide additional teaching resources to support the tackling of loss of learning as a consequence of lockdown, and those resources will be taken forward in consultation with local authorities with whom we are engaged about ensuring that these resources are additional to the teaching complement that's available and active within the education system today.
Gillian Martin, followed by Alexander Stewart, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Many pupils in my constituency rely on school buses to get to school. The Deputy First Minister has advised that social distancing is not going to be needed on school transport. Can he give us the rationale behind that decision, first of all? And can he give an indication of any additional guidance and support available to parents, pupils and to bus operators on any measures that they may have to take to make school journeys as safe as they can be?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the rationale behind the advice that's been provided to us by our expert group is that the prevalence of coronavirus is at a very, very low level amongst children and young people, and that the evidence which is available to our advisors, which is taking account of evidence within Scotland, the United Kingdom, Europe and further afield, indicates that young people are are not particularly active in the transmission of coronavirus. So therefore, the requirement for physical distancing within schools is not judged to be appropriate. What the advice then goes on to say is that we should consider school transport as essentially an extension of the school estate, and therefore no physical distancing should be required in that context. In relation to the question of guidance, we will be publishing guidance on the 30th of July, which will draw together advice on all questions in relation to the reopening of schools, and that will include issues in connection with school transport to ensure that there is proper and clear advice available for bus operators with whom we have been in active discussion, and also with parents and families to ensure that everybody has knowledge of the issues and can proceed on a safe basis.
Thank you. Alexander Stewart, followed by Emma Harper, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Given the Cabinet Secretary promised to offer all newly qualified teachers guaranteed employment for the next academic year, I welcome the funding committed in the statement today. But can the Cabinet Secretary confirm that councils will be given all the necessary funding and support to fulfil these commitments and support newly qualified teachers' job security?
Cabinet Secretary.
Clearly, the government is allocating resources to enable local authorities to employ additional newly qualified teachers. That is the purpose of the funding. It will be ring-fenced for that purpose to make sure it is used for that purpose, to ensure that we are successful in boosting and expanding the teaching population to be able to contribute to the work that is necessary to support children and young people in addressing learning loss that has been a factor in the experience of lockdown.
Thank you. It's Emma Harper, followed by Claire Baker.
Good afternoon, Deputy First Minister. What support will be available for pupils who might have to self-isolate for 2 weeks to ensure that they don't fall behind with their schoolwork and that they can continue to engage with classroom activities?
Cabinet Secretary.
Officer, this is one of the issues that will be, I suspect, an ongoing feature of aspects of our education system in the period ahead. Coronavirus has not disappeared, and there will still be cases that emerge, and there is the likelihood that young people may well have to self-isolate as part of the efforts to contain the spread of coronavirus. So there will be an obligation on the education system to make sure that those young people are properly supported in their learning at home, to make sure that they in no way suffer any learning loss. And that will be one of the priorities of the education system, to ensure that the needs of all young people are met when the overwhelming majority of young people are able to be physically present at school. But in some circumstances where young people are unable to do so because of the constraints of self-isolation, we have to make sure that their education is properly supported.
Thank you. It's Claire Baker, followed by John Mason, please.
Thank you. We know there has been a level of inconsistency on the educational offer across schools, and this risks increasing the attainment gap. At the last statement, I asked the Cabinet Secretary about a pupil equity audit, which he agreed with. Can I ask what progress there has been in implementing this, and what targeted interventions will be introduced?
Cabinet Secretary.
The government is taking forward the necessary work to ensure that we identify all of the issues and factors and responses that are inherent in an equity audit, to identify what is the scale of the challenge, what measures we can take to address that, and what impetus we can put into the education system to make sure that the issues that arise out of the equity audit can be properly and fully explored. The interventions that we are taking forward focus very strongly on boosting the size of the teaching workforce to enable that workforce to make a substantive contribution to ensuring that we do not see any further expansion of the attainment gap, and that the needs of children and young people are met as part of their activity and participation in the education system. And that will be a very focused element of the work that we take forward to address the contents of the equity audit.
John Mason, followed by Jeremy Balfour, please.
Thank you. I've been contacted by peripatetic teachers who therefore go around different schools and have quite a lot of contact with different teachers and a range of different pupils. Are there any special arrangements for them when the schools go back?
Cabinet Secretary.
Officer, peripatetic teachers are one grouping where we are likely to have to make alternative arrangements to how they deliver their contribution to the education system. Mr. Mason is correct. There are many peripatetic teachers who will be in a number of schools, perhaps even during a day and certainly during a week. So local authorities and schools will be working closely with peripatetic teachers to work out ways in which we can minimise the number of visits that are made to schools. That will be, unfortunately, one of the priorities that we have to take forward. Try to reduce the number of visits to schools so that we can avoid any unnecessary circulation of the virus. So that will involve some degree of changes to working approaches, but they will be taken forward in discussion with peripatetic teachers.
Jeremy Balfour, followed by David Torrance, please. Mr. Balfour, you don't have your microphone on. Can't hear you. I'll come back to you, Mr. Balfour. We'll get that sorted. I'll come back to you. I'll take David Torrance first. Mr. Torrance, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am pleased to hear that 50 million will be specifically used to recruit additional teachers and support staff. Deputy First Minister, what guidance will be provided to ensure that this additional resource can support young people to mitigate the loss of learning of pupils due to the lack of access to resources or because they have additional support needs?
For Cabinet Secretary, you answer, if we're not going to get Jeremy Balfour back, perhaps you could type your question in the chat bar and then we can have the question answered, if that's possible. David Torrance says, sorry, Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, Mr. Torrance's question really gets to the heart of what I was talking about, my statement of moral purpose and imperative of education, which is to ensure that the life chances of young people are transformed by the positive good and benefit of education. So we will be, the additional resources we're putting into the education system for the employment of teachers is designed to address very directly the point that Mr. Torrance has raised. In addition to that, we have to make sure that the needs of all young people with additional support needs are properly met in the resumption of schooling. And in that context, we must take care, and schools will take care, to ensure that proper transitional arrangements are put in place to ensure that young people can make a safe and effective return to school when it's appropriate for them to do so.
And if possible, is Jeremy Balfour able to come on now? No, we haven't got you, Mr. Balfour. So where's the question in the, I can't see it. I'm looking at the question. Right, I'll read out. Can you read that, Cabinet Secretary? Will after-school clubs, breakfast clubs be able to open in August, is his question.
I think we're ideally, yes, but we will have to take very specific risk assessment steps to ensure that we are able to come to the right decisions about those activities. Certainly, essential breakfast clubs I would want to see as a priority to make sure the well-being of young people is supported. Some of the after-school clubs may involve a degree of connection and contact which runs contrary to the general advice that we're putting in place about trying to minimise the circulation within individual schools, and they may have to wait longer before they can be restarted. The priority is to commence the starting of mainstream education and to make sure that that is available for young people. and we will do our level best within the education system to open up broad opportunities for young people at the earliest possible opportunity.
Thank you very much. That concludes questions on the statement, and we'll find out what went wrong for you, Mr Balfour, but we got there. That concludes the questions, and it'll be time to move on to the next item of business, so I suspend Parliament until 2:55. Thank you all.